So at this point, we have our JWT token provider that we can use to generate tokens, verify user token and user information and things like that. Now, what we have to do now, we need to have a way to stop users who are not authenticated, or if they have a bad token, to access the application. And that's when the idea of filters come into play. So when we talk about filters in this context, it simply means that when a request comes into the application, it's going to go through a series of filters, and then we can do a lot of checks during this time. So while the request is going through the filters, we can check to see like if the token is valid, is the username is correct, and things like that. And then we can either say reject the request or accept the request and process it. So this is the whole idea of filters. We just have like a line of defense before we actually accept the request. So we need to build a filter that can take every request that comes into the application to make sure that they come in with the appropriate token and that this token is valid. And then we can verify the user and then set the user as an authenticated user. And that way the request can go on and be processed. So let's go back here in the main package. I'm going to go ahead and create another package, and I'm just going to call it filter. So in the filter package, I'm just going to create a class, and I'm just going to call it JWT authorization token. Authorization, not token, filter. Okay, so JWT authorization filter. So this filter is to either authorize or not authorize any request that comes in, any request, but it's only gonna do that once. It's not gonna do it multiple times. So for this, we need to extend a very handy class called once per request filter, which means whatever is gonna be happening into this class, it's gonna happen once. And if we have to extend this class, then we have to implement a method called doFilter internal. Okay, so this method is gonna fire every time a request comes in, and that's only gonna happen once. Okay, so here we need to bring in our JWT token provider. So this is a private JWT token provider, and we're just gonna call it JWT token provider, and then we can pass it in the actual constructor of this method. So I think if I do alt insert, and then I can do constructor, and I can do that. Okay, so I don't have to do this I know. So we pass in the provider into the constructor, so whenever this class is constructed, we will have a JWT token provider available that we can actually use in the application. So in the doFilter method, for our purposes, all we have to do is to check to make sure that the token is valid, the user is valid, and then once we can verify that information, we're just gonna set that user as the authenticated user. Okay, so as you can see, this method is very handy. doFilter internal, we have the request, the response, and the filter chain, so that we can pass in the request whenever we're done with it. So what we have to do now, we have to take that request and make sure that the method is not option. So the reason we have to do that is because whenever there's a request that goes into the server, the first request goes, so for instance, let's say I issue a request to, for instance, get users, right? So before this is issued, the get is issued to get the users, there's an option, the same request but with a different method. So that what the purpose of this is to find out information about the server, what the server accepts, and headers and things like that. So that's why whenever the request comes in and the request is for the options method name, then we're not going to do anything, because we just want this to always go through so that the client can collect information about the server, so that they can handle everything the way that it should, because it needs to know what the server accepts and what the server doesn't accept and things like that. It gets a little bit more complicated than that, but I don't want to go into all the detail. But the point is, if it's options, which is a request that gets sent before every request to collect information about the server, we have to let it go through. So all we have to do now, I'm just gonna call this request, this name is too long for me, and response. Easier and more to the point. So let's do if the request, right? So request, and I can get the method, get method. Okay, that's gonna return either get, post, or options, or delete, or something like that. And then we can check to make sure this is equals to, let's do equal ignore case, because it can be uppercase and lowercase. And then we can call the security constant, so that option HTTP method, so which is going to be right here. Okay, so if it's option, in that case, what we want to do is to just let it go through. We're just gonna do response, and we set the status. So set status to OK, which is coming from Spring HTTP status from Spring.OK. Remember, we looked at this class, and then we need to get the value, which is gonna give us the actual like number. And here we set the response to OK. And then after that, we can go ahead and check to see if it's not option, and then we can put in our logic. But before I do, let me see if I can do some static import here. So I statically import those values so our code can look nicer. Now I have to do else in case if it's not option, so in case it's like a get request or a put request or whatever else the case might be. So now I have to make sure I can get the actual token. So let's do string authorization header, because the token is going to be in the header, and then here we can call in on the request to get the header, and then the header that we want is the authorization header, so we can do authorization. So let's do HTTP headers from Spring, HTTP headers that authorization. Authorization, that's the one that we need. Okay, we're looking for the authorization header. So that's gonna give us a string of the actual authorization header. So then we can check to make sure it's not null. So we can do if the authorization, right, header that we got, if it's null, or if it doesn't start with the token prefix, which is bear, then we don't necessarily need it. So we can do if it's not null, or if it doesn't start with the actual token header, which is bear. So to start with, and then we can pass in the token header, which is coming from our security constant that token prefix, not header, prefix. Okay, so we pass in the prefix. So if this is not the case, then we know this is not the authorization headers that we're looking for. Maybe there's like a separate one, authorization headers, but it's just not ours because it doesn't have the prefix bear in front of it. So in that case, then we can just call the filter chain, and then we just do filter, and then we pass in the request and the response, because we're not doing anything with the request anymore. And then after that, to stop the execution of the method, we can just do return, and then we don't return anything. So that at this point, then after this line, the method would stop executing and it won't go through all the other logic. So again, just to recap, when the request comes in, we're just gonna go ahead and check to make sure that it's not option. If it's option, in that case, we just set the response to OK because we're not doing anything. Otherwise, we're going to try to grab the authorization header. So we get the request, and then we call get headers. We pass the headers name that we want. Let me see if I can do a static import for this. So we pass in the actual authorization header, which is what it's going to be, the authorization header. And then we make sure that the authorization header is now null, or it doesn't start with the prefix. Because if it doesn't start with the prefix, then we don't care for that authorization header. We don't know what it is, but we're not going to work with that. We're only going to work with the one that starts with barrier. Okay, so if that's not the case, then we just pass in the request, meaning when we do filter chain, we pass in the request and response, we just let the request continue its flow. And then after that, we just stop the execution of the method by just calling the return and then not return anything.